Welcome everyone to today's explainer, the Beer Hall Putsch, a paradoxical victory. Today we're stepping back exactly 1 century into the pretty tumultuous streets of 1923 Munich. We're going to unpack a massive historical moment, tracing the events chronologically to understand how a seemingly disastrous, chaotic street rebellion actually set the stage for one of history's darkest chapters. Right, let's dive straight in by exploring the central paradox of our whole story here. How on earth did an absolute humiliating defeat, I'm talking about a treasonous coup that was totally crushed in less than 24 hours, somehow launch a dictator? Well, to answer that, we need to look at the strategies, the giant miscalculations, and the frankly astonishing courtroom drama that followed. Part 1, the post-war boiling point. To really grasp this chaos, we first have to look at the desperate, volatile atmosphere of Bavaria in 1923, right after World War I. Let's look at the ideological fuel burning at the time. You really need to understand this one critical concept to get early Nazi mobilization, the stabbed-in-the-back myth. After the Treaty of Versailles severely diminished Germany's power, a lot of former soldiers and citizens just couldn't accept that they'd actually lost militarily. Instead, they bought into this completely false narrative, blaming civilian leaders, Marxists, and Jews, and labeling them the November criminals. And honestly, this narrative became a hugely powerful mobilizing force for the early Nazi Party. All of this turned Bavaria in the fall of 1923 into a literal powder keg. Tensions were escalating incredibly fast. The Bavarian prime minister actually declares a state of emergency and hands dictatorial powers over to State Commissioner Gustav Ritter von Kahr. And what does Kahr do? He immediately bans 14 mass meetings planned by Hitler. Talk about a pressure cooker. Hitler was terrified his followers would defect to the communists if he didn't act immediately, so he and his paramilitary stormtroopers felt forced to execute a bold, right-now kind of takeover. Which brings us to part 2, chaos in the beer hall. With everything boiling over, the scene shifts to the evening of November 8, 1923, at the Burgerbräu Keller in Munich. The execution of this coup happens at breakneck speed. Just picture this. Inside a massive beer hall, Kahr is giving a speech to a crowd of about 3,000 people. Outside, 600 SA members are quietly surrounding the building. Then, suddenly, Hitler bursts in. He pushes right through the crowd, jumps up on a chair, and actually fires a pistol into the ceiling to hijack the room. He screams that the Bavarian government is deposed and then forces Kahr, along with Police Chief Seisser and Military Commander Lossow, into an adjoining room at gunpoint, demanding they join his revolution. I mean, just listen to the sheer theatrics of that ultimatum. A history professor who was actually in the hall that night noted how Hitler completely flipped the mood of those 3,000 trapped people in a matter of seconds. He described it as almost magic or hocus pocus. With these incredibly dramatic ultimatums, he totally bent the bewildered crowd to his will. But here's the thing. Behind all those theatrical speeches, the actual tactical plan was unraveling into a complete farcical mess. They bring in World War I hero Erich Ludendorff to give the whole thing some credibility, and the hostages are basically coerced into publicly supporting the coup. But then, Hitler makes a massive tactical error. He leaves the hall to run an errand in the city, and in his absence, Ludendorff incredibly just lets the hostages walk right out the front door. Naturally, those leaders immediately contact the military and police to crush the uprising. So that takes us to part 3, blood in the streets. Let's move to the morning of November 9th and see how this rapidly builds into a fatal climax. By this point, the element of surprise is completely gone. Realizing the coup was falling apart, the conspirators were honestly on the verge of just giving up. But then, Ludendorff impulsively commands the remaining 2,000 men with a simple shout. Wir marschieren! We will march. What's really wild about this is they just began marching into the center of Munich without a specific destination or tactical objective in mind. Things escalate from desperate political theater to a violent standoff so fast here. After sending men to seize the city council as hostages, Ludendorff leads this disorganized mob toward the defense ministry. But when they get to the Odeonsplatz, right in front of the Felderharle monument, their path is completely blocked. Waiting for them is a solid barricade of 130 armed soldiers and state police. The standoff didn't last long at all. A chaotic firefight broke out that lasted only moments, but it left exactly 20 people dead, 15 Nazis, 4 police officers, and 1 completely innocent bystander. The man linking arms with Hitler was actually shot dead, pulling Hitler to the ground and dislocating his shoulder in the process. Totally defeated and scattered, Hitler and Ludendorff fled the scene. The putsch was officially over. Which brings us to part 4, a trial for propaganda.
With the Putsch crushed and Hitler arrested for high treason just 2 days later, the story dramatically shifts from the bloodstained streets into a courtroom.
And this is where the paradox really takes shape. Instead of facing severe punishment in obscurity, Hitler was handed this massive national platform. Astonishingly, the presiding judge, Georg Neidhart, allowed a man on trial for treason to open with a nearly 4-hour speech. Hitler boldly claimed sole responsibility for the coup, fully cementing his title as Führer or leader. Because of this highly publicized 24-day trial, a failed local radical suddenly generated front-page headlines all over the world. In his closing statements, Hitler expertly just ignored the actual legal charges of high treason. Instead, he spoke directly over the heads of the judges to the global public, portraying himself as a patriot who was acting out of pure necessity. His closing remarks were so emotionally charged that they literally brought some of the spectators in the courtroom to tears. Okay, so what's the punishment for armed treason against the state? 9. Just 9 months. Despite being found guilty, Hitler was given the absolute minimum sentence of 5 years in a remarkably comfortable fortress confinement, of which he served less than a year. The deeply sympathetic judge even protected him from being deported back to Austria, absurdly ruling that a man who just tried to overthrow the state thinks and feels like a German. Part 5. The strategy shifts. The absolute crucial point here is how this incredibly light sentence allowed Hitler to completely reevaluate his path to power. Calling Landsberg a prison is honestly a bit of a stretch. There was no hard labor here, Hitler was housed in a comfortable cell and allowed to receive visitors for hours every single day. He used all this uninterrupted downtime to dictate his ideological manifesto, Mein Kampf, to his fellow inmates Rudolf Hess and Emil Maurice. But far more importantly, as he sat in that cell, he realized that attempting to violently overthrow the government from the outside was a fundamentally flawed tactic. Now, this brilliant pivot is the main takeaway you should remember from this explainer. Before 1923, the Nazi strategy was all about brute force, armed revolution in the streets. But post-1923, the strategy pivoted entirely. Hitler decided he had to acquire power strictly through legal, democratic means. He would use the very systems of the Republic to gain influence, backed by relentless propaganda. He realized you can't just smash the system, you have to dismantle it legally from within. And the leniency he was shown revealed a fatal flaw in the Weimar establishment. It's a dynamic known as combination. Conservative leaders actually believed they could piggyback on the Nazi movement. They foolishly thought they could put a leash on this radical beast to secure their own political power. And this exact dynamic of legal subversion, born right here from the ashes of 1923, repeated itself exactly 10 years later. In 1933, conservative elites led by Franz von Papen legally invited Hitler into a coalition government, fully believing they had him under control. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this pretty haunting thought. We've just seen how a chaotic, poorly planned shootout in Munich failed in all its immediate goals, yet provided the exact national stage and strategic pivot needed for future domination. Take a moment to consider how the sympathetic institutions and the democratic leniency of the Weimar Republic ultimately and entirely legally handed a failed street rebel the keys to the nation. Thanks for joining me today, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.